A woman named Lee Holloway has just been released from a mental hospital on the day her sister is having a wedding party. At the party, a man named Peter comes to talk to Lee. They soon decided to dance together. A moment later, Lee's father came to her. He hugged the daughter he had missed all this time. After that, Lee's father invited Peter to talk, but Lee suddenly felt upset and went straight to the room. She picked up an object under the mattress of her bed. There was a box containing a collection of sharp instruments. Then Lee tried to cut herself and treat it. At night, Lee saw her parents fighting again. It was the fights her mother and father had every day at home that drove her crazy. But not long after leaving the mental hospital, she witnessed the fight again, saw her mother fall down as a result of being pushed by her father, and felt depressed again. Whenever Lee felt depressed, she always wanted to hurt herself. Lee had previously been boiling water, then brought a hot kettle to the room. In the room, she again committed the act of hurting herself. The next day, Lee then attended a typing training. She took an exam using a typewriter and got a good score. Meanwhile, at home, Lee's mother began to realize that her daughter's bad habits had not completely disappeared, even though she had been successfully cured by a psychiatrist. She hid all the sharp tools in the house so her daughter wouldn't hurt herself. But Lee accidentally saw what her mother had done when she went to take out the garbage. This put her in a bad mood, but she found a newspaper in the trash and read about a job opening that put her in a good mood again. Lee then came to apply for a job as a secretary at the law office of Edward Gray. But when she entered the office, Lee was shocked to see that the whole room was very messy. She meets a woman who is a paralegal in the office, but she seems to ignore her. Then she walks down the room and meets a man who suddenly interviews her. The man is Gray, a lawyer who needs a personal secretary. Gray asks Lee if she wants to get pregnant, if she lives in an apartment, and a bunch of questions about Lee's background. Soon Gray asked Lee for a cup of coffee, but by the time Lee went to make coffee, the mineral water had run out. Inevitably, she had to pour a gallon until some of her clothes got wet. When Gray saw that he was immediately interested and accepted Lee to work there, Lee's sister, who knew the news of her sister being accepted to work, was very happy. Lee then lived her days as a normal person by becoming Gray's secretary, such as typing, taking care of documents, and many things done by Lee. Until one day, Lee took the initiative to bring coffee to Gray, who was busy injecting flowers with preservatives in his room. Gray then said that he had accidentally thrown away his notes. Without thinking, Lee went straight to the trash can and went inside to look for the note Gray was referring to. While from the window, Gray watched Lee, who was willing to do what she was told. When Lee managed to find it, she happened to see her mother waiting for her in the parking lot. Lee's mother not quite believing that her daughter had recovered. Shortly after Lee returned to Gray's room, Lee was immediately given many tasks at once, ranging from coffee that lacked sugar, to typing multiple copies of files, to repairing a mousetrap. Meanwhile, Gray secretly watches his secretary until he notices that Lee has several scars on her thighs.
Avoid the temptation.
Shortly after, the office phone rang. When Lee answered it, a woman came into the office. The woman was Trisha O'Connor. Trisha came in very emotional and even yelled very loudly to find Gray, but Gray did not want to be found. Then the phone rang again. It was Lee's father calling her, but an upset Trisha took Gray's coat and stomped on it. She told Lee to get Gray to sign the deal, but when Lee returned to the phone, unfortunately Lee's father had gone to hang up. This made Lee upset and she picked up her things to hurt herself again. Unknowingly, Gray soon came out and saw her bad habits. After work, Peter and Lee had a rendezvous at a laundry, where Peter admitted that he had a nervous breakdown. Soon, Gray arrives at the same place and realizes that Lee and Peter are there. He then watches Lee while hiding in a pile of clothes, until he sees Lee and Peter pressing their lips against each other. Gray sees it and leaves the place. Back at the office, Lee's days are tough. Everything Lee does is considered wrong by Gray. Lee is repeatedly asked to correct the typing of a wrong letter. When the typing is perfect, Gray refuses to read it. Gray even comments on Lee's shabby appearance and bad habit of stamping her feet and playing with her hair and tongue, which makes Lee seem even more depressed. Meanwhile, after work, Lee visited Peter's house, where Peter's parents had mentioned marriage. The next day, Lee is already working with her new look. Gray appreciates her by calling her into his office. Soon, Gray asked Lee to talk. Gray wanted to know what Lee was really experiencing all this time, why Lee was hurting herself again and again. He provoked Lee to tell him her personal problems. When Lee opened up a little, Gray immediately took the role of her boss and said that he ordered Lee to stop hurting herself. Lee was silent and said yes. Gray said that Lee was a grown girl. She should walk home alone without her mother waiting for her. Lee obeyed Gray's orders and told her mother that her mother was forbidden to wait for her or pick her up while she was at work. The next day, Lee made a typing mistake. Gray came over and scolded her, which made Lee depressed again. But he no longer carries a small bag of sharp tools to hurt herself. Gray then asked Lee to come to his room with the requested letter. While in the room, Gray asked Lee to bend down and read the letter in front of him. Just a word spoken softly, Gray immediately slapped her, which made Lee read the letter aloud. The slap was delivered to Lee repeatedly until Gray finally stopped. After Lee was asked to return to her desk to continue typing, Lee finally realized that the slap on her buttocks was a punishment from Gray. When she went to the bathroom, Lee noticed that her buttocks were red from the hard slap, which made her think of something. Lee then continued to make the letter and gave it to Gray. While she was duplicating the letter, Gray came knocking on the door and complimented that the letter Lee made was very good. Lee was pleased with the compliment. At home, Lee told her mother that she didn't need the tools that could hurt her anymore. And sure enough, on her way to the office, Lee threw all the boxes she had used to hurt herself so far into the river. From then on, Lee went about her work in Gray's office with many thrills that delighted her. From being spanked, often on her buttocks, to being treated like a pet, Lee acted as a submissive secretary for Gray. Whatever her boss told her to do, she would obey. And even now, Lee became very fond of the things Gray did to her. One day, Lee realized that she had made a typing mistake, but Lee deliberately let Gray see the mistake so that she would be punished. But unfortunately, what Lee expected didn't happen because Gray was busy with his work, which made Lee angry and disappointed that her boss didn't teach her a meaningful lesson today. While relaxing with the family, Lee's mother gets a call from the hospital with the news that Lee's father is being treated. They immediately see his condition. Lee, seeing her father sick again, felt depressed until she dared to meet Gray that night, because for her at that time, Gray was a figure who could cure her of her previous bad habits. But when she was at Gray's house, Lee realized that what she wanted was a mistake. Then she reasoned with Gray so that her boss could check the case file tomorrow morning. After Lee gets used to and likes what Gray is doing to her, however, Gray seems to change and gets busy with his work. Lee's passion is now only a spanking, but despite all the persuasion and trying, Lee never gets it from Gray. So at home, Lee spanks herself alone in the bathroom because he can no longer hold back the passion in herself. On the other hand, Gray seems to have repented, trying to ignore his secretary's temptations. With nowhere else to go, Lee goes to Peter for some fun. But unfortunately, Peter doesn't understand what kind of game Lee wants. In the middle of the fun activity, Lee clearly found it boring. The next day, Gray was surprised to see his letter envelope with worms in it, so he took a red marker and circled it and asked Lee to come to his room. Lee, knowing her plan was successful, looked happy and went to her boss's office, but instead of getting a slap on the butt, Gray asked Lee to lift up her skirt. Lee had prepared well for the contact with Gray. She was ready to take the law into her own hands, but unfortunately, Gray was busy getting himself out on his own. Lee left Gray's room very disappointed. She went to the bathroom. When she realized that Gray's semen was on her shirt, she immediately had fun alone in the bathroom. Unknowingly, her coworker heard what she said from the other side of the bathroom stall while shedding tears. When Lee came home from work, Gray went straight out of his room and destroyed all the frames on the wall. The frames were letters with red scribbles that he had corrected. Then Gray took a photo album containing several photos of women and burned it. Then Gray wrote a letter to Lee, but he abandoned his intention. Soon Lee came to the office and was asked to bring a correction letter for Gray, until finally Lee realized that the whole office had been messed up. While in Gray's office, Lee was immediately asked if she was getting pregnant, if she lived in an apartment, all questions that had been asked previously while Lee applied for a job in Gray's office. Shortly after Gray fired his secretary, Lee was shocked by Gray's statement that day. She cried and was disappointed in her boss, who had taught her things she had never experienced in her life. While Gray wanted to end the game and felt that he couldn't go on, Lee honestly said that he wanted to get to know Gray better, but Gray realized that there had been a mistake between them, and he wanted to apologize to Lee for what he had been through as he handed him an envelope. Lee cried bitterly after being firmly thrown out of her office by Gray. When Lee got home, she opened the envelope and found a check for over $600. Lee wanted to tear it up, but she realized that she was on the right track. Lee can only contemplate in the swimming pool with what she has experienced and what else to do in her life later. Soon after, Lee looked around Gray's office and saw that a new secretary had come in to take her place. There was nothing Lee could do but reflect on her experiences so far and admit that she was crazy about Gray. Until finally, Lee looked for a match through the bulletin board in the newspaper. There were a lot of men she invited to date, but some of the men she met did not arouse her passion to have fun on a date. Until one day, Peter came to propose to her, and in the end, Lee decided to accept Peter as her husband. But before the wedding, Lee suddenly runs away from the event and goes to meet Gray at his office. Without further ado, Lee immediately barged into Gray's office and said that she loved Gray and wanted to have a deeper relationship with him. Gray was very surprised that Lee suddenly revealed this. Gray then tried to send the crazy woman away, but Lee was stubborn and refused. Confused about what to do, Gray finally ordered Lee to put her hands on the table. And Lee complied because she still adored Gray. Whatever Gray ordered, she would obey him as long as they could be together. But shortly after Lee put both hands on Gray's desk, he left Lee just like that. His future wife disappeared, of course, and Peter was busy looking for her until he finally found Lee in Gray's office. Peter was very surprised to see Lee, who seemed to be going crazy again, because Lee just sat there with both hands on the desk and wouldn't leave. They got into an argument as Peter forced Lee to leave, but his efforts were in vain. Lee kept running back and immediately sat down on the chair and put her hands on the table while Gray just watched them from outside the room. Peter tried repeatedly to persuade Lee to return, but Lee kept returning to the table, following Gray's orders until Peter finally gave up. Unexpectedly, Lee stayed until morning, not moving from the table for even a second. Without eating or drinking, not for a second did Lee move her hands from the table. Although everyone came to visit Lee, sister, father, mother, future in-laws, everyone tried to give her advice, but Lee remained stubborn and wanted Gray. Right now, in Lee's mind, she has orders to put her hands on the table and she won't lift them until she gets new orders from Gray. Until the whole town knew the news about Lee and many visited her. Gray, who read the news through a newspaper, then came to see Lee, who was still in the same position at his desk. Gray then took Lee out of his office and immediately bathed her. In the end, what Lee had wanted all along finally came true with her crazy act of staying at Gray's desk for a few days. After some romantic fun, they decide to get married and live their lives together.